Hello. I wanted to talk about how to get started with tarot cards. There's so many different paths you can take in the beginning there. And seeing you don't know much, you're not going to know. It's just a guessing game at that point. So I thought I would give some basic ways to start approaching this whole thing with the tarot. If you're interested in the tarot because you hear about their divination ability and that interests you and you want to learn how to read the cards, whatever your reason, I think it's good to have some initial plan in place about how to go about doing that. And it's so hard to begin with today because there's so many options out there and so many sources, and they all have different opinions, including me. I've taught a lot of classes on the tarot 30 years. And I know what I went through. And mine was pretty easy because today I didn't have the options and the choices that you have today and all the authors that you have today. So the first thing I would say that you want to try to do, as far as I'm concerned, my opinion is, remember, you want to have fun with this. So enjoy it. Don't worry about learning the correct way or the incorrect way. There really isn't any of that. Have fun with it. And you're going to be buying more than one deck of tarot cards. That I can tell you right now. You're going to buy different tarot decks today because there's so many out there. And if you start talking to other people that read, they're going to have ideas as far as decks. And you're going to see they have all these different decks. And it's going to really throw a lot into you. Let alone the authors. Just the decks alone are amazing today. My opinion on the deck is, and I've said this before with other videos, if you could read a Marseille deck, you could read any tarot deck out there. And it's just because a Marseille deck is so basic and simple. And it's basically the starting deck. It's what they started with, was the Marseille. 1700s. And on my deck, my Marseille deck, I think it says here, the most authentic tarot deck in circulation today, the Tarot of Marseille. So yeah, it's the oldest one out there. Well, if you could read the Marseille deck, it really makes it easy to look at any deck and say, I could read this. Because the Marseille deck is a lot of pip cards in there. No, you have the 22, a tarot deck is 22 major arcana cards, very mystical looking cards. That's one pack of cards. And then you have 56 minor arcana. That's a separate pack in there. And they both work differently, even though it's one deck of cards. And the minor arcana on a Marseille deck is just pip cards. So you have 5 of swords. Here's a 5 of cups. It's just 5 cups on there. There's nothing. A lot of people say, oh, there's nothing to read there. Well, yeah, there is. Here's the nine of swords. Nothing to read there. There is, if you know the numerology behind it and what the meaning is. And then you have the regular major arcana with pictures on it. And you have court cards in here too, with the minor arcana. So here's the knight of coins, pentacles. But the pip cards, ace through 10, 4 suits, just showing a number of a specific suit. 2 of swords. There's the ace of swords. This throws a lot of people off. And they say, I don't know how I could read that because there's nothing to look at. But if you could train yourself to look at, to know that the numerical value of the card is where the meaning is, then it doesn't make any difference what deck you're using. Whether I'm using a Rider-Waite deck a Marseille deck. Here's another version, BP Grimmett's deck, Marseille. Or something like this, the Egyptian Tarot, or here I have the Allen Tarot deck. I've never used this. I don't even know where I got this. This is old as hell. I don't know where the hell this is from. But here's Zanghini. I had this out for a while, or lately. You can use any of these decks. The Aleister Crowley Thoth deck, I got here somewhere. It doesn't make any difference because you learned just by looking at a pip card and the number on the pip card, 8 of Swords. Okay. 8 of Swords to me means this, regardless of what the picture is on this deck here, or this deck here, or this deck here. It doesn't make any difference. And that'll help you, especially today, because they have so many new decks coming out. Here's the Black Tarot. And this is just, there's no color in these. It's just black and silver images. And these pictures here look nothing like the Rider-Waite. So if you learn on this deck, the Rider-Waite deck, which used to be a very standard deck for a lot of artists. Here's the Morgan Greer Tarot. This is in the 80s. This goes pretty much with the Rider-Waite. The images are pretty much the same. You could identify the 8 of Swords on this deck. Well, actually, that's the one card you can't. Let's say the six of Cups on this deck. And you can see it. Oh, yeah, it's the same type of picture. The same story going on in that picture. But you get a deck like these newer decks, like the Dark Tarot. Those images aren't going to look anything like what these look like. And that might throw you off. But if you learn with a Marseille deck, no image is going to throw you off, whether it's this deck or any other deck, because you know that the three of Cups, what the meaning is, regardless of the picture. So my way of thinking is that if you learn a Marseille deck, you could read any tarot deck. A lot of people will tell you differently. They'll say, learn the Rider-Waite deck, because this was a standard during the I would say in the 90s and even in the 80s, a lot of people were saying, in the late 80s, were probably telling you, get this deck, because any books out there and even other decks will be pretty much using this deck as a guide for their teachings and their decks. I think that's over now. I don't think that's the case anymore, or at least not as much as it used to be. And now I think it's a real advantage to know the Marseille deck, because now with the Marseille deck, even back then in the 70s and 80s and 90s, if you knew the Marseille deck, you could read any deck, because there were these other off-the-wall decks like this Egyptian deck, or this one that I don't know anything about. They were out there, but not like today. Today, there's so many people making decks. There's a lot of stuff out there, and they're not using the Rider deck as a lock as far as what that image is supposed to look like. Either that, or you might want to just say, okay, I'm gonna, like I said, you're gonna get a couple decks anyway. You probably end up with a half a dozen decks. You get this deck, the Rider-Waite, and you get a Marseille deck, and then fan it out from there on what decks you want. And you'll see the difference on these other newer decks coming out and how they've changed a lot. So my suggestion is, if you're going to learn 2 decks or get used to 2 different decks, I would say, yeah, stick with the standby, the Rider-Waite, and the Tarot Marseille. my version is there's a lot of them out there. They're all look this. They're basically the same classic image, like playing cards. The images will look the same from one artist to another because it's a classic look. Nothing's going to change there. At least nothing drastically. My deck, my Marseille deck, is really reproduced from the Tarot Marseille by Grimmad. As far as it's all redrawn. My deck, I redrew everything on this deck. But I changed, the big part of it was the changing of the palette. My colors are what I would say more updated than today. The older decks have a primary colors in there: red, blue, green, yellow. My decks are used, my palette is a little bit more updated, and I think it looks nicer because of that. And they are redrawn. So that's my deck. But anyway, that's not what's important here. What I'm saying is any Marseille deck, you could pick them up real easy. And you might not ever use them really professionally. Or maybe you look after you learn that, you might say, well, I like this deck here. This new deck. I know one reader right now, pro readers, this is the deck she uses. And she loves it. This is really new. This is only, I think, a couple of years old, 2 years maybe. And so yeah, they're changing. The tarot is changing. This is a beautiful deck. If you look at this, it's all black. All these cards are black. So it's a nice look. And the backs are just a ghosted image on them. And then the pictures themselves are curious. That's the Hierophant. That's the Hierophant card. Wheel of Fortune. So they're really modernized. And here's the Ten of Wands. Just really artsy stuff. This is nothing, look anything like this deck. Actually, it doesn't look anything like a Marseille deck either. But so you'll find, and this is beautiful deck. I don't, the only thing I don't like about this deck is this, the art, the card stock is a beautiful stock. It's all black. And so it's not, usually you would see a white, this would be white because it's cut. But they actually took the time to make this edges all black on here. I don't know how they did it, whether they started with a black stock, totally solid black, or what, how they did it, but whatever they did, it's a unique looking deck. But it's not an easy deck to slide off the top cards. So you might end up grabbing 2 cards instead of the top card. And I don't like that. I like to have my decks to have a slide to them. And so you'd have to be careful with that, with this deck. But no deck is perfect. But anyway, I'm just saying that there's a lot of variety. Maybe you just want to get these different decks just for your own enjoyment, and you would never use them. I would never use this deck professionally, but I wanted to own it, so I said I'm going to buy it just to look at it, and that's all I've ever done with it. So finding the deck and finding one that I think if you wanted to start as far as a good foundation deck to learn from, my suggestion is the Marseille, and you might want to also go with a Rider-Waite tarot deck. And if you learn those two, at least Marseille deck, learn that. And if you can read that deck, like I said, you can read any tarot deck. And you won't have any problem with it. Because it's got to be hard in the beginning because you don't know, you're going to invest all this time learning these cards. And you might not even use this deck. And so the deck you use might have totally different images on it. So you don't know where to begin with that. I would also say the advantage of starting out with a deck like the Marseille is it's a good foundation, like I said. But you can read professionally with it. Obviously, I do. Always have. But I've also gone with other decks. I've read with this, Morgan Clear. I've read with all sorts of different decks. The Rider-Waite I've used a lot. I've used this deck. I've used, and I like them all. But I knew I wouldn't have any problem reading them because I started with the Marseille. Tarot deck is just a tool. What you do with that tool is the reading. So your preference of tools is one thing, but it's not the important thing. It's knowing those cards and get ideas from those cards. And that's what you would learn when you start to learn how to read cards, is how to get ideas from these in a reading. As far as good sources go, as far as books, I would stay away from the classic Tarot of the Bohemians by Pappas. It's a nice book to have on your shelf. I have it right here, Tarot of the Bohemians. This is from the 50s, I think. But it was written in 1880s. So it's really confusing. And it doesn't really go hardly anything at all. 350-page book. It hardly goes into the application of reading the cards at all. It talks about the powers of the meanings and the numerology behind it, but it doesn't get to it. So it's really a dry book to read if you want to learn how to read cards. It's going to be like, yeah, well, okay, I'm trying to, you're going to be missing. You don't get anything out of it like you would today out of other books. Probably the first cut and dried, no nonsense book that came out that I knew of was A Complete Guide to the Tarot by Eden Gray. This is a hardcover version. You can get this in a pocketbook today. 1970. And that's a good book. I always taught with the Rider-Waite deck because that's what most people wanted to get familiar with. But I'm starting to change that now. And I'm saying it doesn't make any difference what deck you want to use. If you want to learn one that you could pretty much understand any tarot deck with, start out with the Marseille. And if you want to use the Rider-Waite as like a safety guide or something, you don't want to go strictly Marseille, pick up the Rider-Waite deck too. There's a lot of other books out there, a lot of great authors. Most of them today get right to the point. Or like the Tarot of the Bohemians, there's nothing in there about how to read tarot cards as much as talks about all this mystical stuff going on. But it's a good book to have on the shelf, just to have. Rider-Waite deck, Rider-Waite's book, The Pictorial Key to the Tarot. That was written in 1910 as well. That is another book that's very confusing. And it's just that's the way they wrote back then. And now things are more to the point. Get right down to it. This is what you do. And back then it wasn't that way. So Pictorial Key to the Tarot, yeah, it's a nice book to have on your shelf. Tarot Bohemians, nice book to have on your shelf. As far as older books go, classic that are good, 1970. The Complete Guide to the Tarot, like I said, Eden Gray, she was good. She really got right to the point with things. And you won't find much of anything that's really out of she uses the Rider-Waite deck too in here. She uses the Celtic Cross as one of her 3 spreads she talks about in here. And today we call it the Celtic Cross, spelled with a C. Back then, she called it the Ancient Celtic Method. It's a Celtic Cross. She spelled with a K too, but that's not a big deal as far as changes. Who cares how it's spelled? The Ancient Celtic Method. But anyway, have fun with it, and remember the attitude. I think your attitude with the tarot should really be. If you know people that read the cards, that'll help you tremendously, because you'll see that they read and they didn't have to learn every little exact thing in detail precisely in some way. They found their own way. And if you know more than one reader, if you know a half a dozen readers, which you might not, but if you did, you'll see everybody has their own way of doing it. And that's why I like these Zoom meetings I do, because there's a whole bunch of us in there. And if you're just starting out, you're going to see just from small talk that we're having, everybody has their own way. And I think that that's what's valuable about those Zoom meetings. There's a lot of nonsense in there too. It's just people getting together, talking about all sorts of stuff, including tarot cards. But you'll see everybody has a different opinion. A good way to describe it would be if you wanted to look at music and say, I wanted to learn how to play music, I'd like to play in an orchestra and play an instrument, let's say the piano, and do classical music. Classical music is every note is calculated. Every note is planned. Everybody knows their part in that whole big orchestra. There's no imagination in that. You're part of a machine. And if you know anybody that does classical music, they'll probably tell you that. It gets boring after a while because you're just going through the motions. You're very good at it. And believe me, you would have to be an accomplished musician to be able to play in some orchestra. I'm not saying anything bad about that. But if you wanted to get creative and express yourself musically, you're not going to do it that way. And so the tarot to me, as far as in analyzing it to music, I would say it's more like jazz, or it's an expression of you, or blues. It's not like classical music, where it's precise and clear cut. It's not that way. So you're expressing yourself and your ideas. And really what you're doing with a deck of tarot cards is learning to develop and see ideas from these cards as you're laying them on the table for somebody. So having a basic familiar understanding of what each card means in some type of system you have set up, whether it's my system or somebody else's system, will really help you to start to do that. So the main thing is have fun with it. And you're really just learning how to find ideas. A card reading changes your thinking pattern. That's what it does. And I talk about that in my books about the psychology. Now I could be explaining what's happening with a card reading. But it helps you find ideas that you would have never thought of before. And I talk about it. It's a creative thinking technique now. To be understood as a creative thinking technique, very intuitive, and that's it works out very well. Matter of fact, I talk about Michael Michalko. This is his last book, Creative Thinkering. He has some other books I talk about, Cracking Creativity. This is the last one he did. And in here, he's a creative consultant, worldwide known creative consultant. And in here, he actually uses a tarot card to show how creative thinking works, because the tarot is used the same way. So creative thinking. You might like to pick this up and use it with your tarot readings as far as you're learning the tarot, because you'll see how they're very closely related. And that will help you to become a reader. If you are interested in my deck, my Tarot Marseille deck, my classic edition, the green box, is available through me. Go to tarotmaps.com, it's down below, and you can buy it right from me in the USA. If you like any of my other decks that I made, you have to get it through MPC Card Company, which is also available. So sales internationally are there, and you can go there and pick up my one JJ Swiss and my Black Keys edition of my deck and some other stuff, and the international menu on my website. Anyway, next Zoom meeting is Valentine's Day, February 14th. and all are welcome. My site, tarotmaps.com, link down below, will have all that stuff there. And I will say one last thing. If you want to know card meanings, basic card meanings, I think it's a good way to start, is learning the basics. Nothing more than that, because you're going to change them anyway, your own way. You're going to have your own shift in there. You can download keyword meanings from my website in the downloads area. And there's one download for tarot card meanings. Keyword tarot card meanings. As far as my books on the subject, Essential Tarot uses the Rider-Waite deck. This is my second book. Genius of the Tarot uses the Rider-Waite deck, my first book. And Radical Tarot uses the Rider-Waite deck as well. All my books are unique. They all have something in there that the other books don't have, but they all use, these three use the Rider-Waite deck. Bare Bones Tarot. Bare Bones uses my Marseille deck, in depth with the Marseille. And the first three books that I showed you, Radical, Genius, and Essential, all have conversations in the last chapter with the major arcanas. Major arcanas come and visit me, and we had a discussion. More of just a fun thing to read. They didn't really come and visit me. I have a couple other little things out there too. I got Straight Tarot. This is just tips if you want to be a professional tarot reader. This is what I did. This is what got me through it. This is what I was able to do. What worked for me might work for you too. It's just a simple little book. And I got things like this Roadhouse Reader. This just gives you one, keyword meanings for each card. Something to throw in the back of in your bag when you're doing a fair or a party or something. If you need to look up a card quickly, you can. And I also have log books there to keep track of your readings and other things there too. They're all on Amazon. And anyway, keep throwing cards. We'll talk soon.